As you could see, the idea about this panel is to really make it highly interactive with the audience, and we paid some of the members here to be as destructive as they could. So, this is about one of the hot subjects in the industry, about the Northbound APIs. As many of us believe, there needs to be some order in that anarchy around Northbound in order for the SDN ecosystem to take off. Why are we talking about the true north? Because there is obviously magnetic deviation. And what one controller is going to think is the north, there's going to be few degrees of difference between that and the true geographic one. And maybe another one is going to pick yet another direction. So it really depends where you are. And so we are here under the immense light of OpenDaylight, trying to look for a dark star in the night skies. We have these industry experts here with us. Anyone who's working close with the SDN community probably met them before, and in interest of time and to get us off the ground as soon as possible, I'll just give you a one-liner for each of these respected panelists. Starting with Dave Meyer on your left. Dave is the CTO and Chief Scientist at Brocade. He is also the steering committee chair for OpenDaylight and was or still is the chair of IETF SDN RG, among many, many other achievement and industry visible roles he takes. Next to him is Pere Monclus, CTO at PlumGrid with Cisco before that. Raza Sarvar, who's director for cloud and SDN at the Advanced Technology Group with HP, also has this role that I don't know how many of you would like to have too, which is he actually has the chair of the Northbound API work group in the ONF. So direct lots of fire towards him. Then we have Mike Dvorkin. Mike is Insieme co-founder and was the chief scientist. Now he moved with Insieme to Cisco. He's DE at Cisco, and he was driving the original policy, vision, and ACI strategy that Insieme took. So here's another angle for you guys to go check. And last but not least, we have Colin Dixon from IBM Austin Research Lab. He works on SDN, surprise, and he's focusing on data center networks. For those of you who were following the early and somewhat tumultuous days of OpenDaylight, he is one of the co-authors of the famous Dixon-Erickson proposal, how we settle some of the SDN controllers fights at that time. And I'm truly use here Uri Eltzur with Intel, and also surprisingly working on SDN. So we could organize this into three buckets, and we would like to really work with you. Apologize for the logistics and the fact that there is no mic in the room. But if you have questions, please raise your hand and then raise your voice too, and ask that question. We'll start each bucket with maybe one or two leading questions just to frame the conversation. And please chime in. We are all going to be delighted to see as much action from you as from us. Kicking it off with architecture and definition, we wanted to start with giving everybody some idea of what we are talking about when we are talking about the Northbound API. And actually, on that screen, it looks even better than it is on my screen. On the lower right side, we have what I would claim is the classical SDN model that was in the first ONF white paper. On the lower left side is, we cannot call it yet a product, but that's a proposal that is being promoted inside the NBI work group in the ONF. And on the top, obviously, is the hydrogen release. Each of them has a line someplace that we refer to as a Northbound API. So I want to give the panel here an opportunity to share with us their views of what to them is SDN, what is an application, what is network operating system, what should be in the Northbound. Who wants to kick it off?
Go ahead.
So my view is slightly different from what traditionally has been explained as data plane API with a southbound, then controller API, and then some sort of application northbound. The idea is that as soon as you start thinking like that, you're already assuming that this architecture is the way to go and nothing can be changed. And if we go back towards about what's SDN, is it about just creating an orchestration framework on top? Is it about network management? Because if this is the case, defining a Northbound API makes sense. On top of that, you create an abstraction and some sort of policy, and you configure everything. The way we started thinking in terms of the things that we developed at PlumGrid and before that was, well, what if I want to create a new application? And we are talking networking. What if I want to create a new encapsulation, a new protocol, a new network address translation, IPv6, something? Wouldn't it nice to be capable with an SDN framework to create a fully distributed network application? And if this is the case, now what happens is like, why are we spending so much time defining about what's a Northbound API? If you had the proper SDN framework, you should be able to insert these new distributed network functions or applications, whatever you want to call it. And the Northbound API should be a concept that dynamically gets loaded and more APIs can be expressed. So the notion of Northbound API in the current form is already thinking kind of a system or a product. And if we don't break away from this data plane controller application model, we will not be designing real SDN frameworks. We will be designing products and most likely closed products. And this is where then we say, oh, because it's open source is a framework. You say, no, excuse me, I mean, Linux is a platform not because it's open source. Linux is a platform because you have SDKs, tools, ability to upload a new web server, a new application server without having to standardize a web application or a web API, an application server API. So we have to step back a little bit and say, what is SDN, what we were supposed to do to start with, and is the model about standardizing a hard-coded data plane the way to go, and is the model about standardizing a hard-coded Northbound API the way to go?
So I'll go next. I think Pere actually highlights a very important sort of conversation that needs to be had with respect to sort of the layer cake in SDN, and that's this notion that APIs, whether they're NBIs or SBIs, whatever they are going to exist at every level, at every layer in this layer cake, right? They're going to exist at the data plane, at the control plane, at the app plane, and I think much of his work has focused. I think it seems like a lot of the focus is around sort of the network services and the creation and insertion of those, and that's again it's great. It's great to see someone actually taking steps there. Other people here, I won't speak for anyone else. The focus is really on enabling the adoption of these new architectures, these new frameworks, by making them accessible to application developers, right? And that necessitates being able to provide abstractions, right? And the ability to be able to programmatically set policies, maybe do some management, some provisioning at a level where really what you care about is the what and not the how, right? You want to be able to express intent of what you want done with respect to your infrastructure, and not care about what the building blocks of that infrastructure are. So I think it's a good discussion to have, and you can have that discussion at every layer, right? I mean, even in the traditional SDN architecture, there's a northbound and a southbound at every level, and this morning it was referred to as different sort of latitudes and longitudes within within the context of this discussion. I think that's a fairly valid and sort of important distinction that we all ought to pay attention to.
I think the way to think about this, rather than thinking about it in terms of layers, is to sort of think about what is desired by whoever consumes whatever the application is sitting on top of, what kind of state they need from the network, what kind of configuration gets resulted from that. And sort of another surface where the operational policies come into scope, and also how you describe, like as Perry was sort of talking about, like what services are being provided and how they work and how they're getting hooked up to the rest of the stuff. But that should not be spilling into the sort of like definition of the desired state that is specified by the guy who's deploying the applications. And applications meaning like a bunch of compute stuff that's sitting on top of that's consuming various network services. Right. There's also a bottom part of this, which is basically reality, and that's the capability of the platforms and what those things can do. And it's really a sort of a modulation of all three that result in how you deal and configure with the systems. And the way we want to express the desired state within that system should not be representative of the underlying technologies. Mm-hmm. So whether we call it as abstractions, we call it normalization, whether we call it a sort of like policy language, it's generally an implementation deal. There are many approaches, right? And I think, I'm totally policy obsessed, so to me everything is a policy, right? To me, like, you can describe pretty much anything through policy constructs. But, there are different use cases, and in different cases, different things apply. And treating them as one is probably a disservice to the community and disservice to how SDN needs to evolve.
Courtney?
So I guess I'm tempted to say glibly that Neutron is the Northbound API and walk off the stage. But instead I'll say something. So Jennifer Rexford, if you don't know her, you should go look her up. But she wrote a paper called The Networking Philosophers Problem. And in it, she points out that, boy, you networking people really like your artifacts. I think the Northbound API is what's left when you get over your artifacts. It's what's left when you stop thinking about the thing which you've sat down and spent all of your time crafting and start thinking about, okay, what is it that people actually wanted to get out of that? And so that's sort of the same thing everybody else has said, but I think really it's when you forget about the hard work and the things and the software and the craziness that you've built and start actually thinking about what's left when I take all of that away.
So you mentioned Jennifer's name, and for those who in the audience that don't know Jennifer Rex and her work, that is in that strain of let us go define some network operating system, let us define languages like what we are used to see in the compute side of the infrastructure, and everything at that point becomes abstraction. Now, Mike here suggests that we don't need to wait for that, and we could simply use policies. The work group that Raza is running is suggesting that maybe all we need is information modeling, and we don't even need to talk about the specific protocols and the APIs. Everything is in the information model. So maybe Mike and Raza, can you relate to that? Is policy Northbound API?
Well, so depending on what you mean by policy, right? To me, policy is a specification of the desired state. And if you look at Raza's approach, is basically a separation of the sort of logical model and the concrete model, and how you can manipulate those things in a largely abstracted manner, right? So I think the general difference between that and policy is very, very thin, right? Because both attempt to represent desired state in certain format, right? So what we do agree on is that when it comes to interaction with the system by the guy who deploys stuff on top of the network, is basically you declare desired state, and how it gets translated into underlying models is basically a matter of the implementation detail. So you can easily treat this as a policy, and policy is generally philosophy, or like how things get resolved and how it get applied, rather than how it translates it to models.
But is the policy work that is being promoted right now in OpenStack and now as a proposed project for ODL, is that, I need to turn my head to the mic, is that going to include information model too?
There's going to be information model, of course, because everything needs to be described in terms of information models, right? It's basically the philosophy of how we want to abstract and how we want to express everything's interaction between groups and sort of like make the definitions of services within that, where what I mean by services as application components or application tiers, and how they're surrounded by memories that provide, rules by which other things within the network interact with them, right? That's a very specific model that can describe a lot of sort of things within the network. It's an approach. Is it going to be the only approach? Probably not. There will be others. And that's what makes this activity, OpenDaylight, really beautiful, is because we can support multiple ways of achieving similar goals, but we'll provide different values for different environments. And whichever one's going to be used most, time will show. That's the only way.
Sure, and I'll just add that the goal of working on information models is really to come up with portable artifacts, right? Things that are usable across different and implementable across different implementations, right? So the fact that we don't want to, right out of the gate, specify that a protocol ought to be RESTful or ought to be, written rather an API ought to be RESTful or that ought to be written in a particular language or using a particular framework is all it's by design, right? We want to have controller vendors have that flexibility to be able to use those common models, and the goal over time is hopefully to see adoption of these models. And we're hoping to work very closely with the open source communities in OpenStack, in Daylight, elsewhere as well as a lot of vendors who are kind of using us as a little bit of a clearinghouse between their open source efforts and their own work right now. I think that Mike had it right. The model is simply just is where you start, right? Even the approach that they're advocating starts with the model.
Can one of you maybe give the audience one example of what you really mean with information model? Just make it a little bit concrete for those who are not paying attention on a daily basis what we're talking about.
Well, a model is a formal description of a set of objects and how they interrelate with each other. That's the most general sense, right? So
I guess
that represents certain reality.
That's a model of a model.
Well, it's a model of a model, right? Well, and models can be recursively defined, right? At the end of the day, there is a meta model sitting behind the scenes.
I can try and take a stab as somebody that's spent less of my time with my head in here, but a model is just basically trying to abstract away the details you don't care about in the hopes that you can get to some higher truth. So, talking about switches and routers and things as nodes, and then being able to say, like, some nodes have the ability to set the management IP address or query the management IP address, and that's part of the model, so you can go grab it. Is that a reasonable, first approximation of trying to do something?
Right. It depends. So depending where in the model you're looking at,
Sure.
right? So there is normalization of the concrete models, right? Which basically you have gobs of devices and you want to describe it in a similar way. There's also a logical model that's expression of the desired state, right? And confusing the two is counterproductive because they're trying to achieve two different things.
And an example of the second one would be taking the whole network and modeling it as a single big switch, where there's no actual direct mappings from the higher order object and the lower order object, but nonetheless you can do useful things.
Right.
Yeah, Dave is really eager to jump in.
I just wanted to make a couple of observations that I've just listened to my learned colleagues here. I think I agree with what Colin said, if I understand what he said, which is one of the things we ought to be doing is trying a bunch of stuff because we really don't know what we're doing, and, which I think is kind of a good approach here. And the other thing that I'm just taking away from this, and I was thinking about this over lunch because we were talking about this, is just this discussion kind of makes me understand a little more deeply how ill-defined the concept of Northbound API is, especially from an architectural perspective. So I don't know what we can go and do with that. But it seems to me that like Northbound API is a concept that it's almost like a holy grail at this point. What's the Northbound API? Can anybody actually define what it is or where it would live or anything like this? In fact, I just heard from Raza over here that, well, there isn't one. There's a bunch of them, and not only that, the form that they take, we don't know. So, it's like, well, what we know is we don't know much about it.
Which is why we have to go try a bunch of things.
But at the same time, you can think about it this way, right? Any API has a protocol that is being used, and there is content, which is the model, right? And how you encode the model in there.
So you see the way, let's say, when you have a problem that you have to think it through for 5, 6, 7 years, 10 years, create an open source initiative that has to mature over a few years. you can have these discussions. The problem is there's always two ways to attack a problem. One is we're going to think a lot and come with a perfect solution. The other is we are going to grow from the pains of today's reality, which may not be perfect, and percolate up, which has its own issues. And the other, which is I think what we should come kind of in the middle, is what about the mechanisms needed to dynamically enable these models in a way that now you would like to create a new information model for the network? Sure, you should be able to do it. You say, no, Pere, that doesn't make any sense because it's not about the network, it's about the infrastructure. Sure. No, it's about the application. Sure. The question is, how do we not get caught into a specific vision that we say, oh, I'm in the application business, I'm going to optimize applications, versus I'm in the infrastructure business, I'm going to do something else, and rather that we say, what are the mechanisms that we have to build in our network operating system, infrastructure operating system? Because when somebody designs, let's say, Windows versus Linux versus Apple OS, did anybody argue about if it should be like Nginx or Apache Web Server, or if we should think about Java virtual machines? And the idea is that you have to create like a set of tools that dynamically you can load things. And then all these things become a possibility where we can see a path towards arriving there. And maybe I'm obsessed about that because I'm in a small company that we don't have 5 years to solve the problem, you don't have 10 years. And it's about how do you make it practical in a way that every single step is meaningful.
But this is not a new thing, right? So people have been building mediation systems and management systems like very long time ago, right? All of this stuff gets recycled and reinvented every once in a while. We're like in a new cycle, or we're like start talking about APIs, and 10 years ago it was Core, but before that it was CMIP. Like TL1 long time ago, right? All those things sort of like in existence forever, right? And like every time we have like this new activity or new ways of thinking, as we think, right? We're like trying to reinvent, and we always like end up with the same thing. That's basically how do you add something to the API that's not there, right? To me, like having lived through this like pretty much my entire life, I've been building control system for like last 20 years. The way I look at it is this: to be able to sustain sort of like additions and extensions and sort of like this kind of flexibility, you need to have a base sort of like framework, mental framework, which can sustain this kind of things, right? You basically need to start reasoning about networks in certain ways. So you're not really bound by any sort of implementation detail. So as I remember, I was saying about the sort of like tree surface problem, where you can always add stuff that's self-described through metadata, which is model, which basically extends the general principles of the model, right? Which is the base.
Which means that essentially are you suggesting that we should simplify the network, treat the network as a connectivity matrix where certain policies can be applied, and clean up some of the messes we've built over 20 years?
So I'm going to add two things in parts. So the first thing which I'm going to add on top of that is that some of you need to start asking questions, and so by the time I'm done talking, think about that. Yep. But the second thing I want to add is so I think this is exactly it. Policy, at least in my world, has very often been a word for stuff we don't understand what we want to do with, and so we'll make it somebody else's problem. And to some extent, if you do that right, and the binding between what you call policy and what you call mechanism is clean, that's a good thing, right? If you can actually push the part which I don't care about as an implementer off cleanly to somebody else and say, here are the kinds of policies which you can express, and this is what this binding is, that's great. And it's actually, making it somebody else's problem is the idea. But that's very dangerous. I think that's what you were getting at, which is that, is network connectivity, is it just a connectivity matrix? If that's the case, that's very limiting in terms of what we can go do. Is it an information model? That's almost so abstract as to be useless. I mean, you have to have some concrete information model which you're talking about, which has actual functions. Put and get is not exactly a great API to use in order to program your network. I'll just toss it out there.
I just want to counter one.
Just a second. I think we demonstrated one point that talking about Northbound API on the philosophical level could be rather amusing, confusing, or a good thing to do after lunch. Before we try and take that conversation a little bit closer to earth and to the concrete, I just want to open it again to the folks here in the audience. Please help us. Don't make it just here are a few folks sitting on the podium and chatting. Anyone who wants to introduce a question? Yes. Okay. You'll have to shout and introduce yourself.
Actually, maybe I'll move that on. I'll move here. So the question I've heard here, a few kind of hints to potential question, and that's why I put that. What's interesting that on all those diagrams, we see one northbound API. And today, I know we're already here that maybe there are more than one. And maybe we need flexibility, and maybe we need a model. So I hear different hints, and for me, it's like deja vu when we started to talk about southbound API. It's more or less about the same discussion what happened at that time, and it's probably one of, you can argue good, bad things, but that's the differentiator of what we have in OpenDaylight when we introduce SAL, when we introduce the model there, when we introduce plugged in into that SAL, etc., that allow us to put multiple southbound APIs. And today we already have here 7, 8 different southbound options API. So you can plug them in. So my question is, why not to go to the sandwich approach in our architecture, where you have something like Northbound API abstraction layer, call it whatever you want, which is model driven, and on top of that you plug in different NBIs, whatever each one brings. There will be more, some of them that will be widely used, and then they will become de facto standard. Some of them will die. Some of them will be for whatever reason, and that becomes kind of sandwich from our point of view. So that at least one way to go in the general architecture. If I know.
Well,
can I try and?
At this point, we're kind of talking more about southbound or northbound abstraction layer.
So can I
so the
translate?
idea-
Just a second. So were everybody able to hear the question in the back of the room? Okay.
So one thing is that the guys at Indiana, the folks at Indiana, actually did the opposite, right? What they built was a convergence. So they had a bunch of applications, and they wanted to run it over a bunch of different controllers, right? It's kind of what same problem, right? And so what they did was they built what was essentially a convergence sublayer going the other direction. So they wrote all their applications to one thing, and then adapted it to all the different things that were underneath it, right? So they kind of created this abstraction, but they didn't go anywhere with it other than for their own internal stuff. But they did kind of the inverse of what you were just describing.
Right.
So it wasn't clear to me. I'm sorry, it wasn't clear to me whether you think that the multiplicity of southbound protocols is a good thing or a bad thing. Yeah, I think we're better off. So on the northbound side, we're all aiming for this holy grail of sort of, I like to call it, the one API to rule them all. And I actually think that that's the wrong thing to aim for, right? Especially at this stage. You're going to see multiple efforts. You're going to see multiple iterations, multiple versions, multiple schemes to be able to go do this. Some of them will survive, some of them will fail, right? Whether we need to create sort of this abstraction layer, I think that's a question that belongs in a particular sort of in a platform discussion for a particular platform, not sort of as a general industry thing. That's my thought.
My preference is never to build sandwiched layered management systems. Top-down management systems never worked really, and they will never work. It's a very complex problem to solve. And as environments become a lot sort of more dynamic and you have to have a lot more churn, introducing unnecessary layers will just further slow things down.
Yes.
It's just the reality of it. We need to start thinking about how various components pair with each other and how they can render themselves into sort of a common understanding of the state and a common understanding of the sort of what is actually desired. Right?
So one of the things that's interesting here is, what's the objective of having a Northbound API? So Mike's kind of has an idea about policy. Some people have an idea about application portability. What was the one that you were driving at, or different?
No, it's just I'm trying to compare, and let's say my comment. Your comment would be applicable also to southbound.
Yes.
Yeah.
So the question, if we decided for whatever reason we decided that our concept is good for southbound API, my question is, why is that was good for southbound, it's not good for northbound?
No, but let me.
So there
continue.
was a good presentation earlier today by the guy from Bluehost. Remember where he's enforcing policies. He's enforcing policies in the host, right? There is a reason why you want to do that. It's the reduction of the failure domain, right? You want to squeeze it to the smallest size possible. And second one is a pure efficiency, right? You don't want to build a centralized application that crunches through a lot of state and understands everything at a great amount of detail. It's just simply an impossible task, right? It's cost and and how fast you want to churn.
Might not be feasible.
Yeah.
But going to the point of
so
sandwiching, going to this point of sandwiching APIs, at the end what happens is that you become bounded of what you can do because you have to go to the common denominator of all these APIs, which is not good because originally you said we created I2RS, OpenFlow, 1PK, XYZ because you wanted to have a rich environment where you could build a controller on top. But now imagine that one only can give you flow connectivity, the other can give you API connectivity, the other can give you something crazy. Now as an application developer, as a controller developer, essentially you are thinking, what the heck? What's the abstraction that these Southbound APIs are giving me? It's just connectivity. And this is the common denominator. Right. And now you say, the only policy or the only abstraction that I can get out of these 5 interfaces that is common across everybody is connectivity, because everything else got broken in one way or another. Right. And now is this thing going back to the Southbound API. I mean, we lived this already like in the VGA days when we had video cards, we go from EGA to VGA to CGA+, and at some point people realized that that was not working, and even the VGA vendors created GPUs, which are processors with an abstraction, call it OpenGL, something else, CUDA. And those were not APIs, because if you have an API, it means that you have already something in your mind. I already know how the future is going to be. I'm going to force everybody to behave and comply to this API, and this is your boundary. Instead, when you say, no, we are going to abstract it in a different way. Now you say, why do we have to have a Southbound API? Why don't we have like an OpenGL equivalent, like OpenFlow to the toe originally was going that direction and somehow stole on that. But there has to be a better way to abstract data planes in order to enable policy frameworks to be more generic. Otherwise, we say, okay, I have 5 data planes. Somebody like Mike will come. No, that's all wrong. We need just a connectivity policy. Now the only Northbound API can export meaningfully is a connectivity policy. That's it. That's the only thing we can export out of a framework that has multiple data.
So just a second, guys. I want to move from the philosophical to, we'll give priority to questions from the floor. Go ahead.
On a different topic, we were talking about Northbound APIs, and most of the examples that we hear are about management applications, network management applications, or earlier we heard about how service providers might differentiate themselves, extending the network with value-added services using the Northbound API. But in the model there on the right side of the diagram, I see business applications. And do you guys actually envision the true business applications, the ones that run business, like for example, for a financial company, it may be the ones that do financial transactions, for an enterprise, it may be their ERP system. Those kind of business applications actually leveraging the Northbound API to actually influence the network.
Well,
just a second.
Generally,
yes. Just a second.
Yes.
Just a second.
That's possible.
So I want to build on this question first. So for those who on this side that maybe were not able to hear, the question was, should actually true business application use this Northbound API? And I want to build on this and say, do we want to say that all this work is about northbound to networking? Should we look at networking as part of the infrastructure and start coupling compute and storage with it? Should we simply be very humble right now and say, hey, we are really experimenting, we are really pushing the envelope as much as we can? Maybe it's just OpenStack, Neutron right now, and policy at the networking level, and we leave it at that, and we come another day. What are your views?
So I'll take, so the short answer is yes. I think the long answer is there's two different, two business logic. I think that one of the things that SDN has us revisiting is what is the contract between the application and the network. And in the past, the contract has been, give me a packet and I'll do something with it. Maybe light it on fire, or maybe deliver it. It's sort of up in the air which one will happen on a given day. And so trying to redefine that is, I think, kind of what the question you were asking was, is sort of, are we redefining these contracts so applications are actually asking for some kind of differentiated or different service? I don't know, but that's sort of a different part of the Northbound API than the Northbound API, which I think some other people have been thinking about, which is how do I maybe seamlessly, with no change in the contract between applications and the network, improve the quality of service the network provides on average. So how do I get traffic engineering, which is consuming Northbound APIs in the controller, to run and actually get better performance, despite the fact there's no change between the application and that? And my guess is you'll see some of both. I think finally, now that you have some orchestration platform to call into to figure out like what DSCP bits actually mean in the network, which you can probably go get. You might actually get some of these old things that we had that would try to give you your differentiated service between applications and the network working better than they used to work in the past. And I think that's part of what this ACI initiative is really about. In the past, I would say most people would characterize that as it being a failed experiment. Hopefully this time it won't. I don't know.
So are we still, Mike, before you answer, so I want to understand, so the end of the day as a user, when I'm writing a policy or when I'm using information model, if I'm trying to move my business application, am I still going to be required to understand the DSCP bits and the VLAN and the IP address, or are you guys going to free me of that?
It's the application person has to be absolutely free from this, right? But to answer the gentleman's question, it's allowing the application or business application to directly control network is probably not a very good idea. I think there has to be some kind of policy control loop or feedback loop that basically,
So they're not totally free of it. They're just getting it into a different term that's more in their mindset.
Right. So it's not that you directly go and like fuss with the network. You change your requirements, and then the control loop basically makes sure that these requirements are being satisfied with the network. An application or application container that holds the application sort of like in this like infrastructure sandbox basically adjusts everything that application needs. That's the proper way to think about the problem. As far as whether we want the application guy to understand any sort of explicit networking identifiers, I think it's a crime against humanity. I mean, it's crazy that we need to think in terms of VLANs and IP addresses and like all of this failures. It's completely unacceptable. Right? I think it's a gigantic failure on part of the networking industry that we're still talking about those things, right? At least to our customers, right? All they have to basically say, like, I have these apps, they talk to those apps, that's what they can talk about, and all this stuff needs to be expressed in words and things that are not numerical.
How close are we to that?
Very close.
Very close.
Yes.
So let me
We're on the verge of the future.
Yeah. So let me add, right? I mean, to answer your question directly, I think yes, you do want your business applications to be able to converse with the network. I don't think the applications are ready yet, and that's because we have been guilty of, what do you call them, the crimes against humanity,
yeah.
right? Of not being able to provide the necessary framework. Now that is changing. If you look at some of the use cases that we're looking to formalize in ONF, and there are actually products based on this already out there, right? They're not necessarily ERP systems or CRM systems, but we are looking, for example, at multimedia systems or unified communication systems that have very explicit sort of needs and requirements for quality of service. And a couple of vendors have gotten together. HP was one of them, to say, okay, let's find a way to be able to express these things in a way that doesn't force the unified communications application to know about DSCP bits and know about what paths in the network to take to be able to optimize a particular video connection or a particular screen sharing application. So I think we're getting there, right? And you're gonna start to see that with a class of applications that have very explicit needs from the network infrastructure. They're going to adopt it first, and hopefully your ERP system never needs very specific sorts of network bit markings. I mean, there's something wrong with your ERP system.
But I can give you a counterexample to this, right? I have two tenants, right? Mike, the cheap bastards, and you, who is willing to pay, right? We're running unified communication stuff, right? Your priority is higher than mine, right? If I control it from my application, I can do what I want, right? So the way to think about it is I'm basically allowed to live in a container as far as infrastructure, so it's my sandbox, right? I have requirements onto the sandbox, and how it actually applies to the network is completely sort of divorced from the application itself. It cannot basically go and say network, you do this.
But you damn well want to be able to control the resources that are inside of your sandbox.
Yeah. But that's your sandbox. Right.
So it has to be
so this is all constrained by some containment mechanism.
I actually had a sort of controversial claim. So if we're going to call it QoS, is the interface to QoS really anything other than gold, silver, bronze?
So
Is that
let's
sufficient?
So,
Well, even that is an improvement. Even that is an improvement over what most people are doing.
so you know, there's another thing, and I actually want to ask a question of my colleagues here. Is like, in the case that you were describing, Mike, where you know you have these containerized things, and it asks for some kind of, you know, you ask for some kind of QoS, whatever, for a better term, lack of a better term. How would such a system know that it could satisfy the requirements of all the containers? Because it's essentially the edge coloring problem on a graph. And we know how hard that problem is.
Yes,
It's a very difficult problem, right? And it's not that you can pre-compute it, right? So what you can do is you can observe, measure, and then if you have to relocate, you relocate. That's the only practical thing to do.
And if you think,
So, in other words, you can't actually guarantee it.
of course not.
Well, nothing in the world is guaranteed, right? We can be destroyed by an asteroid 5 minutes from now.
What is it?
Yeah, but let's take it to
Since we have only few minutes left here, I want to start
But
calling
I wanted to show an example of places
yeah.
where we have solved this. And if you think the notion of networking is just an interconnect, right? It's just that we are going from across computers to maybe generalizing in a system, in a distributed system. If you think today, let's say, multi-core systems in an Intel platform, let's say, you have 2 sockets, you have 2 memory controllers, you have a QPI bus. I create my multi-threaded application. Do I have to worry about how to program the TOS bits or the COS bits into a QPI bus in an Intel? No, because there's an abstraction that I have. I want to access certain resource, let's say content delivery networks, a memory address. And now there's going to be a policy where I have an affinity to a CPU, and now I'm going to be served within certain limits of cost. If not, I'm going to run out of resources, and a scheduler will have to place me somewhere else.
Right.
Now what we are growing is that from a computer, we are starting to think, let's say, data center. And from a data center, you start thinking internet-wide, whatever. But these problems have been solved in different environments. We just have to elevate the problem.
Exactly.
Just a second. We have short time. I want to give each of you 1 minute to actually wrap it up in the spirit of OpenDaylight. So OpenDaylight actually has a release out there. It obviously has few APIs, few applications coming from different vendors. Two questions for each of you. Every person gets 60 seconds, which you guys didn't do a good job of so far. So, the following question: should ODL continue along the same lines? Is ODL leading towards some unification of Northbound API? What should I expect out of ODL in the year 2014? In that subject of Northbound API, are we defining some de facto Northbound API? Is the conversation still going on? And we'll start with Colin.
I think that was 5 questions
exactly.
and not 2. I mean, so I think that the first question we got actually sort of pointed out the right thing, which is we're going to have a plethora of Northbound APIs. Let's start building things and see what sticks. Yeah. We just don't know what the right answers are right now. We've got a bunch of smart people trying a bunch of different things. And by all means, please come and join the party and contribute code. I mean, the coin. I have my coin in my pocket. I can get it out. But code is actually the coin of the realm. If you get it working in code, that's going to have value over any kind of philosophizing that happens up here. So come, join, and build it. I'm going to fall on the side of we should build it first, and that'll be the de facto standard when it gets ticked up.
Dave.
I mean, I couldn't have said that better, Colin. That was perfect. I really agree with what Colin was saying. I think our understanding of, notwithstanding Mike's deep knowledge of policy and all of that stuff, the Northbound API stuff, it strikes me as very POSIX-like, you know? It's like there's a bunch of things we're going to try, and the ones that were most popular amongst the developers won.
Yep.
Raza?
Yeah, we had very strict instructions from Uri not to agree strongly on everything. I think we did a good job on, but on this particular point, I think really the only way to find success with Northbound APIs is to keep trying, right? And that's actually one of the key reasons why the ONF effort right now, a lot of people sort of conflated with the standardization effort. It's not, right? It's a forum to sort of get together. Let's try stuff out, not just put it on paper, but let's put code behind it, right? And let's try and land that code in places like OpenDaylight, in places like OpenStack, maybe even in some commercial vendors, and see how it turns out. So really, I think I'm looking forward to working with this community, and I think 2014 will be sort of a seminal year for us.
Mike?
So, can we get it right? No, because that's how evolution works, right? Everything is evolution. So I disagree with everybody just for the sake of disagreement. But the way I look at it is this, right? I don't think there is one right way of looking at it, like both from the perspective of the API and from the perspective of the model, right? There will be multiple ways of achieving very similar things. It will depend on what environment you're trying to build those things for and how they're going to be used and what value you're trying to provide. And there will be multiple philosophically distinct ways in which we can solve that. And none of them will be like worse than others, or they might be. It doesn't really matter. That's the beauty of the open source. It's purely Darwinian.
Valerie?
I think it's a very exciting project. To me, the only thing to be careful is the fact that because the starting point that OpenDaylight is kind of a controller concept, you assume or you are given a set of data planes to work with from the multitude that we have available today. That tends to bias a little bit the thinking towards network management and orchestration, because you assume that you will never be able to develop a new data plane. So I think we, as a community, what we have to do better is define if this is going towards network management and orchestration, or OpenDaylight should become a little bit bigger on scope in the sense that even defining the principles underneath that you can express network functions or things like that. Apart from that, I think is a very good start with the hydration release, and looking forward to see how it evolves.
So we are about at the time. So I'll officially close it by saying I guess everybody here should walk away with the feeling, okay, potentially there is going to be a better day where we don't need to know the details. Obviously, at this point, we all are involved in this bigger experiment. Please come, join, support the community, and work with us to see which of those ideas, which of those models or policy-driven is going to change the way we think about the way applications, network, and the rest of the infrastructure interact with each other. We are in the beginning of an interesting road, and if you're awake either at the night or in the daylight, there's always something you could do here. Thanks everybody on the panel. Thanks everybody in the audience. And if people want to keep asking questions till we get kicked out of the room, please do so. Thanks.